Hi everybody, it is week 4 of the Intro to Systems Theories course, and this week we are diving into part 2 of First Order Cybernetics. Great job so far on the discussion board picking up on the concepts from part 1. It seems that many of you are grasping an understanding of the material we've covered so far, which is fantastic, and we'll continue to build on the concepts. I did notice that some of you are already seeing relationships between some of the concepts from the First Order Cybernetics material. And this is the way I want you to be thinking throughout the course, which is to say thinking systemically, thinking in context and thinking in terms of relationships. So continue to see how these ideas hang together and help us to develop a new way of understanding human relationships and human behavior. The First Order Cybernetics material we're covering this week will continue to build on that understanding and expand your ability to think in systemic terms. So the first concept we're covering this week is that of information and feedback. According to Bekvar and Bekvar, the authors of one of your texts, communication or information flow is the energy input and output of human systems. This communication can also be described as feedback. So remember that in cybernetics, we're thinking of the analogy of human systems like machines. If we were to think about a human system as a machine that has a form of input or a form of output, as machines do, then that input and output would be communication or feedback. Okay, more commonly in the cybernetic tradition, we're going to talk about this energy inflow and outflow as feedback. Feedback responds to and indicates fluctuations or changes within a human system. Okay, so whenever we're talking about feedback, we're talking about changes in the system as a function of information that is flowing in or out of that system. Negative feedback is one of the two types of feedback that we talk about in cybernetic systems. Negative feedback occurs when the output of a system acts to oppose changes to the input of the system, so that the overall result is that changes are gradually reduced. If the overall feedback of the system is negative, then the system will tend to be stable. Okay? This part that's emboldened here is really the clincher. This is the most important aspect of the negative feedback concept. I'll read it again. If the overall feedback of the system is negative, then the system will tend to be stable. Okay, so negative equals stable. In negative feedback, any change or deviation from the normal range of function is opposed or resisted. The change or deviation in the controlled value initiates responses that bring the function of the organ or structure back to within the normal range. Okay, that's a really fancy and convoluted and overly wordy way of saying input is resisted by the system and homeostasis is maintained. Here are some examples of negative feedback that might help to bring this idea home a bit more. A good example of it is a home thermostat. Okay, a heating system works as a negative feedback mechanism. The thermostat contains the receptor and the control center. Okay, the receptor being the thermometer and the control center. If the heating system is set at 70 degrees, the heat will turn off if the temperature drops below that. After the heater has heated the house to 70 degrees, it will shut off, effectively maintaining the ideal temperature. The control of blood sugar by insulin is another example of negative feedback. When blood sugar rises, receptors in the body sense that a change has occurred. Okay? Then this change is resisted. In turn, the control center, in this case the pancreas, secretes insulin into the blood. Okay, so this is a response from the system that effectively lowers blood sugar levels. Once the blood sugar levels reach homeostasis, the pancreas stops releasing insulin. Okay, let's go into positive feedback and then we'll go back and simplify these concepts again so you can really see the difference between the two. A system that exhibits positive feedback in response to perturbation, okay, acts to increase the magnitude of that perturbation. That is, A produces more of B, which in turn produces more of A. Positive refers to the direction of change rather than desirability of outcome. Okay, so when we're talking about positive in cybernetic terms, we're not talking about positive in the conventional way. as a good thing, right? As the desirable thing. We're talking about it in terms of change having happened. Positive means change has happened. Negative means no change has happened. Okay, so think about the positive and negative in this context as referring to the direction of change. When positive feedback has occurred, change has occurred. Okay, in the positive feedback context, a message that change has taken place within the system occurs as a function of that perturbation that then increases the magnitude of more of it. A produces more of B, which in turn produces more of A. Here are some examples of positive feedback to help that become clearer. A good example is childbirth. During labor, a hormone called oxytocin is released that intensifies and speeds up the mother's contractions. The increase in these contractions then causes more oxytocin to be released, and the cycle continues until the baby is born. Once the baby is born, the release of oxytocin stops, thus ending the positive feedback mechanism. Okay, so once the change occurs, then the feedback process stops. Another good example of positive feedback is blood clotting. Once a vessel in the body is damaged, platelets begin to cling to the injured site and release chemicals that then attract more platelets. This continues to happen, and the platelets continue to pile up and release chemicals until a blood clot is formed. Once the clot is formed, the positive feedback mechanism ends. Okay, so positive feedback in a cybernetic system means that change has taken place. In positive feedback mechanisms enhance the original stimulus. Negative feedback mechanisms inhibit it. Positive feedback mechanisms move a system toward change, and negative feedback mechanisms move a system toward homeostasis. This second phrase on this slide is the core of everything you need to know for the purposes of this class and the way you're going to talk and write about positive and negative feedback. Okay? This concept can most simply and clearly be defined this way. Positive feedback mechanisms move a system toward change. Okay, so positive referring to the direction of change. Change has happened in a positive feedback situation. Negative feedback mechanisms are those that move a system toward homeostasis. The information flows into the system. This new information is resisted by the system, and the system maintains its homeostasis. No change occurs in negative feedback situations. When we talk about homeostasis within the context of cybernetics, we're talking about the maintenance of constant conditions in the internal environment of a system despite large swings in the external environment. For example, when the external temperature drops, the body's homeostatic mechanisms make adjustments, such as shivering, so that body heat is generated, thereby maintaining the internal temperature at constant levels. Forgive that typo there. When negative feedback occurs, the status quo is maintained. Okay? Keep repeating this so this really sinks in the way that positive and negative feedback are explained in this context. One more time, when negative feedback occurs, the status quo, aka homeostasis, is maintained. When positive feedback occurs, change is achieved. Another way of describing change is a new homeostasis. Here is an application of feedback loops as they pertain to therapy. Here's an example of what positive feedback might look like in the therapeutic context. Parents go to therapy because their child is misbehaving. The therapist introduces change to the family system by helping the parents learn how they can agree as a parental unit on how to discipline their child. This causes the family to recalibrate to achieve a new homeostasis. The parents start agreeing and the child starts behaving more. A new homeostasis is achieved by a positive feedback loop being put in place. There is now peace in the family. The family is stable in a desirable way, enough so that they no longer need to come to therapy. A lot of times this is what therapy is all about, supporting the system in attaining a new homeostatic balance, a new set point. By introducing some change that's accepted by the system, the therapist supports that family system in achieving therapeutic change and establishing a new homeostasis within their family system. An example of negative feedback in the therapeutic context might look like this. A stuck family or system can be said to be exhibiting negative feedback. This is some of the stuff we see all the time in our offices as therapists. Here's an example. The child misbehaves and the parents disagree on how to discipline her. The child continues to misbehave and the parents continue to fight about it. Despite intervention from a therapist, nobody's behavior changes. Therefore, the homeostasis remains the same. Now, here's a really important reminder. Okay, it's a reminder in general because of the meaning of these concepts within the cybernetics context, but it's also a really important reminder when we start thinking about this in terms of therapy. When we're talking about feedback, systemic feedback, positive and negative don't mean good or bad. This is not a value judgment. So we're not using the terms in the conventional sense. We're using them in a different way here. So in this example that I've just explained, the fact that this is negative feedback isn't hinged upon it being a bad thing. The family maintaining its homeostasis isn't necessarily a negative thing in terms of it being a bad thing. That's a value judgment that doesn't pertain to cybernetics. We're calling it negative feedback and a negative feedback process because no change has happened. The direction of change is negative. There is no change and homeostasis is maintained. In the context of therapy, we think a lot in terms of stability and change. Of course, most people, when they think about therapy and the reasons why people tend to go to therapy, they think about change. People tend to seek out a therapist or they tend to go through the therapeutic process in order to attain or achieve some kind of change. But for a system to function optimally, change, which as you read, is referred to in cybernetics as morphogenesis, must be accompanied by stability, which we refer to in the cybernetic context as morphostasis. Too much movement in either direction, either toward change or toward stability, threatens the system in a variety of ways. So in therapy, we always consider change in the context of stability and stability in the context of change. We want people to experience the new and different kinds of things that they're seeking, perhaps improvements in their relationship, shifts in their family dynamics, differences in their relationship to themselves, while also maintaining stability, supporting these systems in maintaining enough stability so that there's a balance and the change can be maintained and supported. When a system functions well, it allows for both change and stability. It invites change while also maintaining some stability and systemic integrity. Another concept that we'll talk about this week in our discussions and that you'll probably write about throughout the trimester when you have these opportunities to submit writing assignments is the concept of rules, roles, and boundaries. It's an important concept when we're talking about human systems as cybernetic systems. Rules refer to redundant patterns of interaction within a system. Rules within a system are either implicit or explicit. They're either overt or they're implied and hidden within the system. So you think about the rule, for example, that children are to be seen but not heard, right? So this might be something that the family makes a clear and stated and explicit rule in the family, particularly a rule for children in this case, or it might just be implied, meaning that this might sort of be something that someone could guess at by seeing how discipline takes place within the family or how children are treated when they're in the presence of adults. The kinds of things that children might be reprimanded for might reveal an implicit rule about children being seen but not heard. Right? So I want you to reflect on, and if you're up to it, you can also post in the discussion board, what are some of the different rules of interaction between parents and children in your family? Or what are some of the rules of interaction in general? And which of those are implicit, which are explicit? Roles is another significant concept, in the cybernetics context. Roles refer to expectations about certain patterns of behavior in the family. And different individuals within a family system play and have different roles in that family system. And roles may also be implicit or explicit. There might be a spoken and agreed upon expectation, for example, that the father of the household, right, the father of a family system might be responsible for certain types of activity in the household. He might be the peacemaker, right? And this might be something that everybody agrees upon, or this might be some role that he's just kind of fallen into as a matter of habit and as a matter of practice and process of interaction with other members of the family system. So what role do you play in your family? Boundaries is another concept that hangs together with the concepts of rules and roles. Boundaries are defined by the rules and roles within a family. So the roles that individual family members play and the rules or patterns of interaction in a family define the boundaries within that family system. Boundaries distinguish how a system is separate from other systems. So there are boundaries within the family system, and there are boundaries that separate the family system from other systems. These boundaries show how all the parts of the system are connected and how the system is connected with other systems. Boundaries are the means by which systems accept useful information and screen out information considered unacceptable from the environment. Boundaries allow information to enter and leave the system. So in this way, they are permeable. They are not solid, fixed, and rigid. The amount of information a system allows in or out is an indication of that rigidity or flexibility in the boundary separating or connecting that system from other systems. The openness or closedness of the system is determined by the boundaries. Okay, so I'll read that sentence again. The amount of information a system allows in or out is an indication of the rigidity or flexibility of the boundary or the openness or closedness of the system. An appropriate boundary is one that allows a family to grow and develop in a relationally healthy way. So families that are optimally healthy, family systems that we might consider, at least in terms of cybernetics, optimally healthy is one that sets the kinds of boundaries that allows for some information from outside the system to come in so that the family can be open to change and new possibilities, but not so much that the family loses its integrity. What are some of the boundaries as you consider this concept in your family? And are there boundaries that you believe would need to be more rigid for your family to function in a healthier way? Can you think of a time when a boundary has been set in your family that resulted in significant change in the system? Okay, so these are questions that I want you to reflect on, not necessarily that you need to answer, but I want you considering using your own family system as an example, how boundaries operate to allow information to enter the family system. Right? So my family tended to be, when I was growing up, a fairly closed family system. There were some really rigid boundaries that kept our family from adopting new information or new ideas from outside the system, perhaps ideas that might have supported my family, information about lifestyle choices and health and the food that we were eating, or the way that we handled some of our family interactions. It would have supported our family to have perhaps been a little bit more open and flexible in our boundaries, the boundaries that separated and connected us to other systems. So when we think about family systems, we want to think about health in terms of how flexible and malleable are those boundaries so that there's a systemic integrity. There's a sense of clarity that this is a system. There's something that defines the system as such. And at the same time, it's a system that's open enough to change and flexible enough to allow new information to enter and leave the system. We talk about, in cybernetic terms, different relationship types, and there are three in particular that we tend to refer to. Those are complementary, symmetrical, and parallel relationships. Complementary relationships are those that are defined this way. The individuals involved in the relationship display opposite behavior patterns. Traditional couples can be defined, for example, or described as complementary. Each spouse is assigned a role that doesn't compete with the role of the other spouse. One is breadwinner, one is homemaker, for example. One is dominant, the other is submissive, for example. Since there's no competition in complementary relationships, they tend to be collegial and peaceful in nature. The downside is that there can be a lack of freedom on the part of either member of that relationship system because the roles tend to be so fixed in nature. In symmetrical relationships, the individuals involved display the same behavior patterns. Modern couples can be described as symmetrical. The spouses don't stick to traditional roles and they operate as equals in the relationship. Symmetrical relationships can be competitive. The individuals challenge and stimulate each other, keeping each other on their toes. So the upside is that there is a lot of freedom in these types of relationships. There is a sense of sort of challenge that keeps both partners potentially motivated, but this can also become competitive and even combative. Parallel relationships are those in which the individuals involved display enough flexibility so that both complementary and symmetrical relationship patterns can occur. So there's complementarity and symmetry in parallel relationships, which means there's a sense of flexibility on the part of both people in the relationship system. In therapy, we strive to have parallel relationships with our clients. We want to be able to shift from therapist-client or, from the role of perhaps the professional and, the person receiving the services, to one of more kind of two equals on the path, two human beings sharing an experience. We want there to be enough flexibility around the relationship so that both parties can be flexible in the therapeutic process. In a therapeutic relationship that's too complementary, the client could become too dependent on the therapist. But in one that's too symmetrical, the client could become too resistant to the therapist for change to be able to take place or for any progress to happen. So there you have it. These are our week 4 concepts. They are, as a reminder, information and feedback. Please go back and go over the distinction between positive and negative feedback and the way these concepts are used in the cybernetic context so that you're clear on that moving forward. We went over stability and change and the necessity for both in human systems, particularly as this pertains to therapy. We talked about roles, rules, and boundaries within human systems. And finally, we talked about the 3 relationship types: complementary, symmetrical, and parallel. These concepts are some that you are probably going to want to write about in your short papers and even at the end of the term in your final film review papers. So review them carefully. Go ahead to the discussion board when you're ready to respond to that question and pose any questions of your own about this material. And let's keep the conversation going. This PowerPoint this week, this material this week, closes out the cybernetic systems portion of the class. So you've now got everything from cybernetic systems. Any questions you have about this particular systems theory, always feel free to pose those in the discussion board, prompt some discussions about it in our conversations with each other. You can also always write a course message so that everybody can benefit from my responses and you feel fully prepared to write those short papers, your first of which will be due very soon. All right, folks, I will talk to you later and I will catch you with another one of these lectures next week. Have a good one.